Okay, so you're probably wondering, well, why is this happening? Why did DDT do this? And actually, here's another picture showing you the process of bioaccumulation. So here you have the different trophic levels. So 1, 2, 3, 4. The little positive signs, the little plus signs are representing the pesticide. Right, so here your grass has a certain amount, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The mouse has now more plus signs. The third trophic level has even more. And then this hawk looks much better than my hawk. Over here has even more plus signs, right? So to the point where what Rachel Carson and other environmentalists were seeing is that the top trophic level is actually the species that became most impacted by DDT. So why is this happening? So DDT and other broad spectrum pesticides were something known as fat soluble. Okay, so what that means is the pesticide actually stays inside of the fat of that organism's body. So this little mouse right here, the fat cells that are there are basically taking in the pesticide and holding it. It doesn't move from its body. It's stuck there. The snake is then holding on to the pesticide again. So basically, the reason why DDT was used is because it's so long-lasting. Well, yeah, it's long-lasting to the point where it lasts forever inside of an organism's body. So it stayed inside the organism. So when that organism gets eaten by the next level on the food chain, whatever was inside of its body gets transferred as well. Now, you're probably wondering, well, do they still do this today? Well, in parts of the world where they have big malaria problems, like I was mentioning, they do still use this, which is obviously not the best thing. Most pesticides that are used today are known as water soluble. So what that means is the pesticide does not stay inside the organism's body. It actually comes out through its pee. So let's say this mouse were to eat this grass. When the mouse pees or urinates, the pesticide does not stay in the body. It basically just goes through the body, right? So it leaves the organism's body, okay? So, but from a point of view from a farmer, right, a water soluble may not be the best because every time it rains or every time there is some sort of natural event, right? So most of the time it's rain or surface runoff. The pesticide basically just gets washed away. So they'll have to reapply it over and over again because it's no longer long lasting. But of course, the pros outweigh the cons in that case, okay? So bioaccumulation, as I've mentioned, is when a harmful chemical like DDT or any other fat-soluble pesticide enters into an ecosystem. They do not exit easily. They're taken up by the individual organism and they do not biodegrade. So what happens is it accumulates higher and higher concentrations inside of the organism's body. So that process is called bioaccumulation. This also goes by other terms, and you may come across this. Biomagnification and bioaccumulation, biomagnification, and there's another term as well. Oh, bioamplification. So it's like amplify. They all mean exactly the same thing. So it's talking about how as you go through the food chain or food web, the amount of that pesticide gets higher and higher as it moves through to the point where the top organism is actually the one that is most harmed. All right, so here's bioamplification. So it means exactly the same thing. It's just another term. So these terms can all be used interchangeably. All right, so here's another example of this. So here is a food chain. Right, so the dots are representing the pesticide or the toxic chemical. So the first trophic level has a low concentration of it, meaning not a lot. As it transfers from one level to the next, you can see here that the top carnivore in this case has a high concentration of it. So meaning it has the most amount, which is most likely the one that is at risk. So from a human perspective, this is also very harmful. DDT was found to also be harmful to humans because if we're eating different items that are on the food chain, all of that chemical compound is going into a human as well. So it definitely wasn't good, which is of course why it's now been banned. Okay, so before I get into pesticide resistance, I just want to reiterate, right? So these fat-soluble pesticides are no longer being used, right? So the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States and of course the federal government of Canada have also put into place in the early 1970s that they are no longer able to use fat-soluble pesticides, which is good for all things. Okay, so pesticide resistance, actually this is a great time to be talking about this because it's something that is concerning at the moment during our COVID-19 time. So what's happening is, over time, if you use a chemical long enough, different pesticides or bacteria or organisms can create what's called a resistance. Okay, so I'll give you an example. You know, on the Lysol, if you're lucky enough to have a Lysol container right now, you know how it says 99.9% of all germs are dead. Kills 99% of all germs. They can never claim 100%. And the reason why is because there are some bacteria and some germs that have developed a resistance to Lysol. So meaning, even if you have a counter and you were to wipe it clean with Lysol, yes, of course, most of them are gone, but you may have one bacteria that's left behind. So what happens is when that bacteria reproduces, they also have the resistance. So you end up having many bacteria that are being formed that have that resistance. So over time, what will start to happen, obviously this takes many years to occur, but because we're using Lysol and disinfectants so much right now, there is a possibility that, let's say within the next 10 years, we will see a large increase in the amount of bacterial resistance. So obviously there are chemical engineers and different scientists that are trying to develop new types of antibacterial cleaning solutions. So over time, the same thing happens to pesticides, right? If we spray grass with pesticides long enough to kill, let's say, a beetle, you're eventually going to have some beetles that it doesn't work on anymore. So what happens is that beetle that survives will reproduce, and then all of their offspring also have the resistance. So what ends up happening is we constantly have to keep creating new pesticides to be used, because after many generations, so we're talking, 40, 50, 60 years down the line, you're going to have to keep changing up the type of pesticide that you're using because it's not going to work anymore. So, of course, we know there's many different regulations that are in place, of course. So, a lot of the strong pesticides that are used on agricultural crops, it's not something you can kind of just walk into Home Depot and buy yourself, okay? So, obviously, there are kind of like home-grade pesticides, and then, of course, there are, agricultural or farmers that will have their own type of pesticides that they're using, okay? But many pesticides are currently water soluble and they're biologically safe because what happens is over time, there's a reaction with sunlight that will cause it to break down. So meaning, again, it's for the downside, it's not long lasting. So you have to keep respraying the crops, but this is so environmentally friendly in comparison to what we had in place, let's say 60 years ago. We're in a much better place. Obviously, we have much more information, technology, and research on our side to know what is better to be used, right? So there's actually a division of Health Canada called the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. And actually, part of their job is to test various chemicals to see how long, the persistence of it, to see how long it actually will stay in the soil. And they monitor essentially what can and cannot be used and for how long of a period of time. So, does that mean that there is somebody coming out to farmers and testing their soil? If there is a concern, they will do that. I used to work at the Ministry of the Environment, and we used to have soil samples and water samples come in all the time to test for pesticides. But usually what they do is they monitor what is being purchased. So, for example, there are certain agencies where you can purchase those stronger pesticides from. They limit how much can be purchased and, of course, how often it can be purchased, right? So that's essentially it for pests and pesticides.